The mahogany doors of the Senate chamber swung open with a weight that seemed to carry the gravity of decades. Hillary Rodham Clinton entered with the practiced confidence of someone who had walked through doors like these more times than most senators currently serving had given speeches. Her powder blue pantsuit was immaculate, tailored to perfection, each crease sharp enough to cut through the thick atmosphere of anticipation that filled the room. She carried no briefcase, no notes, no visible armor except the one she had spent 40 years perfecting. The unshakable certainty that she belonged in rooms where power was wielded and futures were decided. The chamber was packed beyond capacity. Every seat filled, every corner occupied by staff and journalists and political operatives who had cleared their entire day for this moment. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of so many bodies, so many cameras, so many lights trained on the witness table where Hillary would sit. But the real heat, the kind that made skin prickle and breathing difficult, came from something else entirely. It came from the electric charge of a confrontation everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict the outcome of. Hillary moved to her seat with deliberate slowness, acknowledging Democratic senators with slight nods, ignoring the Republicans entirely. She had testified before Congress more times than she could count. Whitewater, Benghazi, emails, the Clinton Foundation. Each time she had survived. Each time she had walked out with her reputation battered but intact, ready to fight another day. She knew the rhythms of these confrontations, the theater of partisan politics, the way to deflect and reframe and wait for the news cycle to move on. She was a master of survival in spaces designed to destroy her. But as she settled into her chair, arranged her water glass just so, adjusted the microphone with the muscle memory of countless testimonies, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. A flutter of uncertainty in her stomach, a whisper of doubt in the back of her mind. She pushed it away immediately, dismissed it as nerves, as the natural tension before a performance. But it was there, that small voice asking, "What if this time is different?" At the front of the chamber, Vice President J.D. Vance sat in the presiding chair with an almost unnatural stillness. He hadn't looked at Hillary once since she'd entered. Not a glance, not a flicker of acknowledgement. His attention was focused entirely on the documents spread before him, a sea of folders and papers and exhibits arranged with mathematical precision. His pen moved across a legal pad in smooth, even strokes, annotating, marking, preparing. There was something surgical about his focus, something that made Hillary's instincts prick with warning. She recognized the tactic because she had used it herself dozens of times. Appear disinterested. Refuse to give your opponent the satisfaction of your attention. Make them feel small, insignificant, beneath your notice. But something about Vance's version of the tactic felt different. It wasn't the nervous disinterest of someone unprepared, scrambling to look busy. It was the patient focus of someone who had all the time in the world because they had already done the work. Because they already knew how this would end. Hillary pushed that thought away too. This was her arena. She had been playing this game since before Vance was born, since he was a child in Middletown, Ohio, surrounded by poverty and addiction and dysfunction. She was the one with 4 decades of experience, with relationships spanning the globe, with a resume that read like a history of American power in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. She was here to remind everyone of that. To demonstrate that experience mattered, that credentials mattered, that you couldn't just write a memoir about growing up poor and think it qualified you to be a heartbeat from the presidency. She had the lines prepared, rehearsed in front of mirrors, in front of aides who nodded enthusiastically, in front of friendly journalists who promised to amplify the best moments. You've written about poverty, Mr. Vice President, but what have you actually done about it? You called your own running mate reprehensible. What does that make you for serving him now? The clips would be devastating. The contrast would be perfect. The seasoned stateswoman versus the inexperienced pretender. By this time tomorrow, the internet would be flooded with headlines. Hillary destroys Vance. Clinton schools VP on leadership. The reckoning. Chairman Bob Menendez gavelled the hearing to order, his voice echoing through the packed chamber with the self-importance of a man who knew every camera in America was watching. This was theater, and everyone knew it. The Democrats wanted Hillary on the national stage. They wanted her to eviscerate J.D. Vance, to expose him as the fraud they believed him to be, to remind America that experience and expertise still mattered in a world that seemed to value neither. Hillary leaned into her microphone for her opening statement. Her voice was measured, authoritative, carrying the weight of someone who had addressed the United Nations, negotiated with hostile foreign leaders, stood in the Situation Room during crises that most people would never know about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to discuss American leadership in a rapidly changing world. But before I address the specific policy questions before this committee, I feel compelled to address the broader context in which we find ourselves. She paused, letting the moment breathe. She had delivered thousands of speeches, tens of thousands of public statements. She knew exactly how to command a room, how to make people lean forward in their seats, how to hold attention through nothing more than the careful manipulation of silence and sound. American leadership is not a given. It must be earned, maintained, and defended. It requires experience. It requires judgment. It requires a deep understanding of how the world actually works and how America can shape it for the better. Her gaze drifted toward Vance, still absorbed in his papers. Time to draw first blood. Unfortunately, we live in an era when experience is dismissed as elitism, when expertise is derided as arrogance, when people with no real understanding of the complexities of global affairs are placed in positions of enormous responsibility. She let the implication hang in the air, heavy and unmistakable. I find that troubling. I find it dangerous. And I think the American people should find it dangerous too. Still, Vance didn't look up. His pen continued its steady movement across the legal pad, as if she were reading a grocery list instead of delivering carefully crafted insults on national television. Hillary felt a spike of irritation. He should be reacting by now. He should look defensive or angry or at least engaged. But he just kept working through his documents with the focus of someone who had more important things to do than respond to her provocations. She pressed forward, her voice sharpening with each sentence. I've spent 40 years in public service. 40 years. I've sat across from world leaders on every continent. I've negotiated treaties that kept the peace. I've managed crises that could have spiraled into wars. I've represented this country in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I've made hard decisions with imperfect information, knowing that American lives hung in the balance. Now she turned directly toward him, abandoning all pretense of subtlety. So I hope the Vice President will forgive me if I'm somewhat skeptical of those who believe that writing a best-selling memoir qualifies them to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. A good story is not the same as good judgment. Personal struggle is not the same as policy expertise. And surviving a difficult childhood, while admirable, does not prepare you to manage the complexities of American power in a dangerous world. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber. Democrats nodded approvingly. Republicans shifted uncomfortably. The media gallery typed furiously. This was what everyone had come to see. The clash. The confrontation. The moment when Hillary Clinton reminded America why she should have been president. Finally, Vance looked up from his papers. His expression was mild, almost pleasant, as if she had just paid him a compliment rather than questioned his fundamental fitness for office. Please continue, Mrs. Clinton, he said, his voice calm and even. I'm listening. The calmness should have been her first warning. The absence of defensiveness, the lack of visible emotion, the patient attentiveness. But Hillary was committed now, momentum carrying her forward like a river that had already passed the point where it could change course. For the next 45 minutes, she delivered the performance she had rehearsed. She lectured about the importance of experience in foreign policy, about the dangers of populist leaders who promised simple solutions to complex problems, about the need for serious people to guide American diplomacy in an increasingly unstable world. Every point was an implicit criticism of Vance, but delivered with the appearance of statesmanlike wisdom rather than partisan attack. She discussed her tenure as Secretary of State, painting herself as the steady hand that had managed the Arab Spring, reset relations with Russia, built coalitions to pressure Iran. She was the adult in the room, the experienced operator who understood that foreign policy was about nuance and relationships and decades of accumulated expertise. Then she moved to the direct attacks, each one designed to go viral, each one crafted to make Vance look small while making her appear gracious and concerned rather than petty. Mr. Vice President, I've read your book, Hillbilly Elegy. It's an interesting personal story, truly. But I couldn't help noticing that your prescription for poverty was essentially to blame poor people for their circumstances. Personal responsibility, you called it. She shook her head with practiced disappointment. That's a convenient philosophy for those who have escaped poverty, but it does nothing for those still trapped in it. She pulled out a sheet of paper, the one her staff had prepared with all of Vance's contradictory statements about Trump compiled in chronological order. This was the kill shot, the moment that would define the hearing, the clip that would play on every news channel for the next week. And then there's your rather dramatic political evolution. I remember 2016 quite well, as you might imagine, and I remember some of the things you said about Donald Trump. She read from the paper, her voice dripping with incredulity. You called him America's Hitler, your words, not mine. You said he was noxious and reprehensible. You said he was leading the white working class to a very dark place. She looked up, letting the words hang in the air between them. Strong words, principled words, one might even say. And yet here you are, just a few years later, his vice president, his most loyal defender, standing beside him as he implements the very policies you once condemned. Hillary spread her hands in a gesture of bewilderment that was carefully calibrated to appear genuine. What happened, Mr. Vice President? Did you have a genuine change of heart? Did you come to see something in Donald Trump that you missed before? Or did you simply decide that principles were less important than power? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the latter. It looks like you said whatever was necessary to advance your career, regardless of what you actually believed. She leaned forward for the final thrust. That's not leadership, Mr. Vice President. That's opportunism. And the American people deserve better than opportunism from someone who could become president at any moment. Vance continued taking notes, his pen moving steadily across the page. His silence was becoming unnerving. The usual rhythm of these confrontations required the target to respond, to defend, to engage. But he just kept working through his documents as if he had all the time in the world, as if nothing she said mattered enough to interrupt his preparation. Hillary pressed on, attacking his views on Ukraine, his skepticism about NATO, his dangerous isolationism that threatened to undermine 70 years of American leadership in Europe. She painted him as naive, inexperienced, completely unqualified for the office he held. Mr. Vice President, I don't doubt your intelligence. You went to Yale Law School. You clerked for a Supreme Court justice. I don't doubt your ambition either. But intelligence and ambition are not the same as wisdom and experience. You've never managed a crisis. You've never negotiated with a foreign adversary. You've never made a decision knowing that American lives were on the line. She gestured around the chamber with the authority of someone who had earned the right to judge. I have. For 40 years I have. And that's the difference between us. That's why your presence in the office you hold is so deeply troubling to those of us who understand what's actually at stake in American foreign policy. The world is dangerous, Mr. Vice President. It's complicated. It doesn't care about your personal story or your political ambitions. It requires experience, judgment, and a deep understanding of how power works. I'm not sure you have those qualities, and I'm not alone in that assessment. She sat back, satisfied with her performance, confident that she had done what she came here to do. I hope you'll take these concerns in the spirit they're offered, as honest counsel from someone who has seen what inexperience can cost. The world is watching, Mr. Vice President. I hope you're ready for the weight of that responsibility. The applause came from the Democratic side of the chamber, just as she had expected. Senator Elizabeth Warren was practically beaming. Cory Booker nodded approvingly. The media gallery was typing furiously, already composing the headlines that would dominate the evening news. She had done it. She had reminded America why credentials mattered, why experience couldn't be replaced by charisma or personal narrative. She folded her hands on the table and allowed herself a small smile. At the presiding chair, J.D. Vance set down his pen with deliberate care. Are you finished, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary's smile was gracious, magnanimous in what she believed was victory. I believe I've made my points, Mr. Vice President. You have, very thoroughly. Vance stood and walked to the front of the dais, carrying several thick folders with him. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who knew exactly where he was going and what he was about to do. "And I appreciate your candor. It makes what I'm about to do much easier." Something in his tone made Hillary's smile falter. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. It was something else entirely. Something calm and deliberate and utterly devoid of fear or uncertainty. It was the tone of a prosecutor who had just watched the defendant incriminate herself and was now preparing to present evidence she didn't know existed. "You've raised questions about my experience, my qualifications, my judgment," Vance continued, his voice conversational but carrying clearly through the now silent chamber. "You've suggested that I'm not ready for the responsibilities of high office, that I don't understand the weight of decisions that affect American lives, that my background somehow disqualifies me from serving in the position the American people elected me to." He set the folders on the desk in front of him and opened the first one with careful deliberation. "So let's talk about experience. Let's talk about judgment. Let's talk about decisions that affect American lives." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since she'd entered the chamber. "Let's talk about Benghazi." The chamber went silent, completely, utterly silent. The typing in the media gallery stopped mid-keystroke. The shuffling of papers ceased. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Hillary felt her spine stiffen involuntarily. She had known Benghazi might come up. She had prepared responses, the same responses she had given to countless committees, countless reporters, countless hostile questioners over the past 12 years. She knew how to deflect, how to reframe, how to make the questioner look partisan and petty. But something about the way Vance was arranging his documents on the desk made her stomach tighten. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't playing to the cameras. He wasn't trying to score political points. He was methodical, almost clinical, like a surgeon preparing instruments for a complex operation. Each document was placed in a specific location. Each folder was open to a marked page. Everything was organized for maximum efficiency. "September 11th, 2012, Vance began, his voice steady and factual, without the theatrical outrage that usually accompanied Republican questions about Benghazi. The American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by armed militants. 4 Americans were killed: Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. Ambassador Stevens was the first American ambassador killed in the line of duty since 1979. He held up a document, turning it toward the cameras so they could zoom in on the official State Department seal at the top. "In the months before that attack, the State Department, your State Department, Mrs. Clinton, received approximately 600 requests for additional security in Libya. The security situation was deteriorating rapidly. Militia groups were gaining strength. Other countries were withdrawing their diplomats. Ambassador Stevens himself sent cables warning of the danger, specifically requesting additional security personnel." Vance looked directly at Hillary. "How many of those 600 requests were approved?" Hillary leaned into her microphone, her voice measured and controlled, falling into the familiar patterns of deflection. "Security decisions were made by professionals within the department based on their assessment of." "That's not what I asked." Vance's voice cut through her response with surgical precision. Not angry, not accusatory, just insistent on a direct answer. "I asked how many of the 600 requests for additional security were approved. Do you know the answer?" Silence. Hillary's mouth opened, then closed. The rehearsed deflections that had worked countless times before suddenly felt inadequate. "I'll help you," Vance said quietly, pulling out several cables with routing slips attached. "Very few. The requests were denied. Some of them bear your signature. Others bear the signature of officials reporting directly to you. But the pattern was consistent. Requests for security came in and denials went out." He set down the cables with deliberate care, arranging them so the cameras could capture the State Department letterhead. "Ambassador Stevens requested more security. He was denied. He asked again. Denied again. He warned that the situation was deteriorating, that militias were operating openly, that other countries were pulling out. Denied. And then he died. Hillary tried to respond, reaching for the talking points she had used so many times before. The security situation in Libya was complex, and the Accountability Review Board found that. Let's talk about the night of the attack. Vance interrupted again, pulling out more documents. The assault began at approximately 9:40 p.m. local time in Benghazi. By 10:00 p.m. Washington time, less than an hour later, the State Department Operations Center had informed the White House Situation Room and senior State Department officials that the compound was under attack. He held up an email, the header clearly visible on the projection screen behind him. From Clinton Hillary to Chelsea Clinton. Sent September 11, 2012, 11:12 p.m. The timestamp glowed on the screen, impossible to deny, impossible to spin. At 11:12 p.m., Vance read, his voice growing harder, you sent an email to your daughter Chelsea. The email said, and I quote, "Two of our officers were killed in Benghazi by an Al-Qaeda-like group." He looked up from the email, his eyes boring into Hillary's. Al-Qaeda. You knew that night within hours of the attack that it was terrorism. Al-Qaeda, not a protest, not a spontaneous demonstration over a YouTube video, a planned terrorist attack by an Al-Qaeda-like group. He set down the email and picked up another document, this one thicker, stamped with classification markings. And yet the next day, and for weeks afterward, you and other administration officials blamed a YouTube video. You said the attack was a spontaneous protest over an anti-Islamic film. You said there was no evidence of a planned terrorist assault. You went on television and said this. You sent your ambassador to the United Nations to say this. You let that narrative dominate for weeks. He pulled out a photograph and Hillary's stomach dropped. She knew what it was before he even spoke. She could see it even from across the chamber. The tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, the flag-draped coffins, the grieving families standing at attention. On September 14, 2012, 3 days after the attack, you stood at Andrews Air Force Base as the bodies of the 4 Americans were brought home. Vance's voice grew harder, each word landing like a hammer. You spoke to the families, and according to multiple family members, you told them that you would bring the filmmaker to justice. You promised them that the person responsible for making the video would pay for what he had done. He looked directly at her, and in that moment Hillary understood that she had walked into an ambush. That every attack she had launched, every condescending word about his inexperience, had been part of a strategy to get her to this moment. Patricia Smith, Sean Smith's mother, has stated publicly and repeatedly that you told her the video was responsible, that you promised to prosecute the filmmaker. Charles Woods, Tyrone Woods's father, wrote in his diary that you told him the same thing. He wrote it down that very day because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Vance's voice filled the chamber, resonating in the silence. You knew it was Al-Qaeda. You wrote that in an email to your own daughter the night of the attack, and then you looked grieving mothers and fathers in the eye while their sons lay dead in flag-draped coffins, and you blamed a filmmaker. You blamed a video. You lied to them about how and why their sons died. He leaned forward slightly. Why did you lie to them, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary's face had gone pale. Her hands, usually so steady and controlled, trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She took a sip, buying time, searching for the response that would deflect this. The intelligence was still being assessed. There were multiple. You told your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night it happened. Vance's voice was relentless, giving her no room to maneuver. What intelligence were you still assessing? You already knew. You knew it was terrorism. You knew it was Al-Qaeda. And you lied to the families of the dead. He gathered the Benghazi documents and set them aside with a finality that echoed through the chamber. Then he reached for another folder, this one even thicker than the first. You lectured me about experience, about the weight of decisions that affect American lives, about the responsibility of high office. He held up the emails, the cables, the security requests, fanning them out like a prosecutor displaying evidence to a jury. 4 Americans died on your watch because your department denied their security requests. And then you lied to their families about why they died. You lied while standing next to their coffins. You lied to grieving mothers who just wanted to know why their sons were gone. Vance's voice dropped lower, more intense. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your judgment. That's your record of making decisions that affect American lives. He set down the Benghazi folder with a finality that seemed to echo in the silence. Then he reached for the next folder, and Hillary felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble brick by brick. Now, Vance said, his voice still calm, still methodical, let's talk about your emails. Hillary had expected Benghazi. She had weathered Benghazi before, survived multiple congressional hearings, countless news cycles, years of Republican attacks. The talking points were burned into her memory. The deflections were automatic, but she could feel that something was different about this confrontation. Vance wasn't attacking. He was documenting. He wasn't making accusations. He was presenting evidence, and the distinction, subtle but profound, made all the difference in the world. Vance opened the new folder with the same deliberate calm. When you became Secretary of State in 2009, you made an unusual decision. Instead of using the State Department's secure email system, the system specifically designed to protect classified information, you set up a private email server in the basement of your home in Chappaqua, New York. He held up a photograph that appeared on the screen behind him, a nondescript server sitting in what appeared to be a utility room. This server, maintained by a private IT company without the security protocols required for government communications, was used for all of your official State Department correspondence. Tens of thousands of emails, 4 years of the nation's diplomacy, on a server in your basement. Hillary shook her head, reaching for her prepared response. This has been extensively investigated. The FBI. It has been investigated, Vance interrupted smoothly, pulling out a thick report with the FBI seal on the cover. Let me tell you what those investigations found. He flipped to a marked page. FBI Director James Comey stated that 110 emails on your server contained classified information at the time they were sent or received. Not retroactively classified, as you've claimed. Classified at the time. 110 emails containing information that, by law, should never have been on an unsecured system. He turned pages deliberately, letting each fact settle before moving to the next. Of those, 8 email chains contained information classified at the top secret level, the highest level of classification. Information that, if compromised, could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. That's not my characterization. That's the official definition of top secret information. Vance looked up. On an unsecured server in your basement. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, letting the cameras capture the moment. Director Comey described your handling of this classified information as, and I quote, extremely careless. Those were his exact words, not mine, not a political opponent's. The FBI director's words, extremely careless. Hillary attempted to interject, falling back on the talking point that had protected her. Director Comey also said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges, which, that's true, Vance nodded. But do you know why, Mrs. Clinton? He pulled out more documents, his movements precise and unhurried. Because proving intent in these cases is extremely difficult. Because the standard for prosecuting a former Secretary of State is different than the standard for prosecuting an ordinary government employee. Because political considerations inevitably affect such decisions. He set down the FBI report and looked directly at her. But let's be clear about what you did. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information, by storing it on an unsecured private server. If any of the people who work for me, any of the career professionals in the State Department, had done that, they would have lost their security clearances immediately. They would have been fired. They might well be in prison. Vance pulled out another document, this one a technical report with dense forensic detail. And then there's what happened when you got caught. Hillary felt her throat tighten. She knew what was coming. In March 2015, the House Select Committee on Benghazi issued a subpoena for all emails related to Libya. He held up the subpoena, letting the cameras zoom in on the official congressional seal. You were legally required to preserve and produce those documents. That's not optional. That's the law. He set down the subpoena and picked up the technical report. Instead, approximately 33,000 emails were deleted. Your staff used a program called BleachBit to ensure they couldn't be recovered. Mobile devices that had contained your emails were destroyed, some of them with hammers, to prevent forensic recovery. Vance's eyes never left Hillary's face. Destroying evidence after receiving a subpoena is obstruction of justice, Mrs. Clinton. It's a federal crime. People go to prison for it. But you didn't just delete the emails. You used special software to ensure they couldn't be recovered, even by the FBI. You destroyed physical devices with hammers. He pulled out a video clip transcript. When you were asked about wiping the server, you said, and I quote, "What, like with a cloth or something?" And then you laughed. He set down the transcript. 33,000 emails, subpoenaed by Congress, destroyed with BleachBit and hammers, and you laughed about it. The chamber remained silent. Democratic senators who had been beaming an hour ago now stared at their desks, unable to meet the cameras. The media gallery had stopped typing. Journalists were simply watching, witnessing the systematic dismantling of a reputation unfold in real time. Vance gathered the email documents. You lectured me about judgment, about qualifications, about fitness for office, but you compromised classified information and then destroyed evidence under subpoena. You treated national security like an inconvenience and the rule of law like a joke, and you've never faced any real consequences for it. He set aside the folder and reached for the next one. Why do you think that is, Mrs. Clinton? Why do you think ordinary Americans go to prison for mishandling classified information, but you walk free? He let the question hang in the air for a moment. Could it be that there's one set of rules for the Clintons and another set of rules for everyone else? He opened the next folder. Let's talk about how you got rich from public service. If you enjoyed watching Hillary Clinton's carefully constructed legacy, systematically dismantled with nothing but documentation and truth, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because this is what real accountability looks like when someone finally has the courage to lay out the record without fear. These are the stories they don't want told in full, with all the evidence on display. Don't miss what comes next. Hillary Clinton had spent decades building walls around her scandals. Layers of lawyers and friendly media and loyal defenders who would attack anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. She had survived Whitewater, Travelgate, the Rose law firm billing records, her husband's impeachment, decades of what she called the vast right-wing conspiracy. Every time she had emerged battered but intact, convinced that she was too big, too important, too protected to ever be truly held accountable. But Vance wasn't attacking her walls. He was methodically documenting what was behind them. The Clinton Foundation, Vance began, spreading financial records across his desk. A charitable organization established by your husband after his presidency, officially dedicated to improving global health, fighting climate change, promoting economic development in poor countries. He pulled out financial statements. Between 2001 and 2015, the Clinton Foundation raised approximately $2 billion, $2 billion, from individuals, corporations, and foreign governments around the world. He looked up. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a charitable foundation raising money, but the timing of some of these donations raises questions, troubling questions about whether you were selling access to American foreign policy. Vance spread documents across his desk in a careful arrangement. You became Secretary of State in January 2009. You were responsible for American foreign policy, including relationships with foreign governments. And during your tenure as Secretary of State, while you were making decisions that affected those governments, the Clinton Foundation received millions of dollars from those same governments. He held up a list. Saudi Arabia, $10 to $25 million. A country where women couldn't drive, where homosexuality is punishable by death, where dissidents are tortured and murdered. They gave your foundation up to $25 million while you were Secretary of State, while they had business before your department. He continued down the list, his voice steady. The United Arab Emirates, $1 to $5 million. Kuwait, $5 to $10 million. Qatar, $1 to $5 million. Oman, $1 to $5 million. all while you were the chief diplomat of the United States, all while these countries had interests before your department, all while you were making decisions that could affect their relationships with America. Vance set down the list and looked at Hillary. You lectured me earlier about women's rights. You called my positions on women prehistoric, but you took tens of millions of dollars from governments that execute women for adultery, that stone women to death for being raped, that treat women as property with fewer rights than livestock. He pulled out more documents. And it wasn't just the foundation. Your husband's speaking fees increased dramatically while you were Secretary of State. Bill Clinton received $500,000 from a Russian bank for a single speech in Moscow, while your department was reviewing the sale of American uranium to Russia. He received $750,000 from a Swedish telecommunications company, with business pending before your department. Vance held up a chart showing the progression of speaking fees over time. Before you became Secretary of State, Bill Clinton's average speaking fee was approximately $150,000. During your tenure, it jumped to over $500,000, but only for speeches to entities with interests before the State Department. When you left office, the fees dropped back down to normal levels. He let that fact breathe for a moment. That's not coincidence, Mrs. Clinton. That's a pricing structure. That's the market rate for access to the Secretary of State, $500,000 per speech. Hillary's voice was tight, defensive. My husband's speaking career has nothing to do with my official duties. They are completely separate. Let's talk about Uranium One, Vance interrupted, pulling out a thick document. Hillary's face went even paler. This was dangerous territory, the scandal that had dogged her for years but had never quite broken through the media's protective barrier. In 2010, the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom sought to acquire Uranium One, a Canadian company that controlled approximately 20% of American uranium production. The sale required approval from multiple U.S. agencies, including the State Department. He held up financial records. During the period when this sale was being reviewed and approved, investors in Uranium One, people who stood to profit enormously from the Russian acquisition, donated approximately $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. $145 million. Vance set down the records. And Bill Clinton received $500,000 for a speech in Moscow, paid by a Russian bank with ties to the Kremlin, while this sale was pending. While your department was reviewing it, he leaned forward. The State Department approved the sale. Russia now controls 20% of American uranium production, and the people involved in that sale gave your foundation $145 million. His voice hardened. You called me a puppet earlier. You suggested I just do what I'm told, but you literally sold access to the State Department. You took millions from foreign governments while making decisions that affected them. You approved a sale that benefited Russia while Russians were writing massive checks to your foundation. He gathered the foundation documents. Who's the puppet, Mrs. Clinton? Who's been bought and paid for? The Democratic senators looked stricken. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Hillary was supposed to be destroying Vance, reminding America of her superior experience and judgment. Instead, Vance had turned her own attacks back on her, using her condescension as an opening to present documentation that she couldn't deny because it was her own financial records, her own emails, her own foundation's tax filings. Vance reached for another folder. Now let's talk about how you've treated women. Hillary's expression hardened. This was personal territory, the contradiction at the heart of her public image. She had presented herself as a champion of women for decades, but the women who had accused her husband told a very different story. Mrs. Clinton, you called me a misogynist. You said my positions on women's rights are prehistoric. You've presented yourself throughout your career as a champion of women, a feminist icon, a defender of those who have been victimized. He pulled out documents. So let's talk about how you've actually treated women, specifically the women who accused your husband of sexual misconduct. Hillary's voice cut through the chamber. My husband is not on trial here. No, he's not, Vance agreed. You are, because you weren't a passive bystander to his behavior. You were an active participant in the effort to silence and destroy his accusers. He held up the first document. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern who had a sexual relationship with your husband, the President of the United States. According to multiple sources, including leaked conversations with Diane Blair, you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. Vance looked up. A young woman barely out of college, targeted by the most powerful man in the world for a sexual relationship. And you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. He moved to the next document. Jennifer Flowers. She came forward during the 1992 campaign with evidence of a long-term affair with Bill Clinton. Your campaign's response was to attack her credibility, to dig up dirt on her past, to destroy her reputation. Later, under oath, your husband admitted the affair. But by then, Jennifer Flowers had been publicly humiliated and her life was in ruins. He continued methodically through the list. Paula Jones. She alleged that Bill Clinton sexually harassed her when he was governor of Arkansas, exposing himself to her in a hotel room. Your team's response was the same. Attack, discredit, destroy. James Carville, your close ally, said, drag a $100 bill through a trailer park. You never know what you'll find. That was how your team talked about a woman who accused your husband of sexual harassment. Vance's voice grew harder. Kathleen Willey, a White House volunteer who alleged that Bill Clinton groped her in the Oval Office. After she came forward, she was subjected to what she described as an orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Her tires were slashed. Her cat disappeared and was later found dead. A stranger approached her while she was jogging and asked about her children by name, mentioning where they went to school. He set down the documents. And then there's Juanita Broderick. The name hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Vance let it sit there, let the weight of it press down on the chamber. Juanita Broderick has alleged, consistently for over 40 years, that Bill Clinton raped her in 1978 when he was Attorney General of Arkansas. She says he forced himself on her in a hotel room. She says he bit her lip so hard it bled. She says he told her to put some ice on that as he left. Vance pulled out Broderick's public statement, her sworn testimony. She also says that several weeks later, you approached her at a campaign event. She says you grabbed her hand and said, I just want you to know how much Bill and I appreciate everything you do for us. She says you squeezed her hand painfully and looked her in the eye. She says it was a clear threat, a message to stay quiet. He looked directly at Hillary. Did you threaten Juanita Broderick, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary's voice was ice. That allegation has been investigated and... I didn't ask if it was investigated, Vance interrupted. I asked if you threatened her. Did you approach a woman who alleged that your husband raped her and send her a message to stay quiet? Silence. Vance let the silence stretch, let the question echo through the chamber and into the cameras broadcasting this moment to millions of Americans. Then he continued. You've built your public image on being a champion of women. You've said believe all women. But when women accused your husband, you didn't believe them. You attacked them. You hired private investigators to dig up dirt on them. You ran what your own team called a bimbo eruptions operation to silence them. He gathered the documents. That's not feminism, Mrs. Clinton. That's complicity. You enabled your husband's behavior for decades. You helped destroy the women who tried to hold him accountable. And then you had the audacity to present yourself as a champion of women's rights. He set aside the folder. You called me a misogynist, but I've never attacked a rape victim. I've never hired private investigators to destroy women who accused someone of harassment. I've never threatened a woman to keep her quiet about sexual assault. He looked directly at her. You have, and everyone watching this now knows it. The chamber was suffocating in its silence. Hillary sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. The confident smirk she had worn at the beginning of the hearing was long gone. In its place was something she rarely showed in public, raw, undisguised fear. Vance reached for his final major folder. Let's talk about 2016. Hillary shifted in her seat. This was the wound that had never healed, the election she was supposed to win, the presidency she had been denied, the humiliation she had never fully processed. In quiet moments alone, She still couldn't understand how she had lost to Donald Trump, how America had rejected her for him. In 2016, you ran for president against Donald Trump, Vance began. You had every advantage imaginable. More money, more endorsements, more media support, more experience. By every conventional measure, you should have won easily. He pulled out documents. But you didn't win, you lost. And according to your own book, what happened, you've never taken responsibility for that loss. He held up a list. In your book, you blamed Russia, James Comey, the FBI, Bernie Sanders, the media, sexism, voter suppression, fake news, WikiLeaks, and the vast right-wing conspiracy. You had an explanation for everything except your own failures. He set down the list. Let's start with how you talked about the voters. On September 9, 2016, at a fundraiser in New York City, you said this about Trump supporters. Vance read from the transcript. You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. He looked up. You called tens of millions of Americans deplorables, irredeemable, beyond hope, beyond redemption. His voice took on a personal edge. I grew up with those people, Mrs. Clinton, the people you called deplorables. They're not racists. They're not irredeemable. They're Americans who work hard, love their families, and felt abandoned by politicians like you. Politicians who look down on them, who dismiss their concerns, who treat them with contempt. Vance pulled out more documents. And your contempt showed in your campaign. You didn't visit Wisconsin once during the general election. Not once. A state that had voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. You took it for granted. You lost it by 23,000 votes. He continued. You barely visited Michigan. You lost it by 11,000 votes. You didn't take Pennsylvania seriously until it was too late. You lost it by 44,000 votes. He set down the documents. 3 states. Fewer than 80,000 votes combined. That's the margin that cost you the presidency. And you lost those votes because you were too arrogant to show up, because you thought you didn't need working-class voters in the Rust Belt, because you called them deplorables and expected them to vote for you anyway. Vance pulled out one more document, and Hillary felt her breath catch. She knew what it was. And then there's the Steele dossier. The words fell like stones into still water. During the 2016 campaign, your campaign and the Democratic National Committee paid over $1 million to a law firm called Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie hired a company called Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS hired a former British spy named Christopher Steele to compile opposition research on Donald Trump. That research became known as the Steele dossier. He held up the dossier. It contains sensational allegations about Trump, allegations that have never been verified and many of which have been actively disproven. Vance's voice was relentless. But here's what matters. Your campaign paid for this. And then this dossier, this opposition research paid for by your campaign, was used to obtain FISA warrants to surveil American citizens. It was fed to the media before the election. It became the foundation of the Russia collusion narrative that dominated American politics for 4 years. He set down the dossier. The primary source for much of the dossier, a man named Igor Danchenko, was later charged with lying to the FBI about where his information came from. The FBI knew there were serious problems with the dossier and used it anyway to spy on American citizens. The entire Russia collusion narrative was built on garbage that your campaign paid for. Vance gathered all the 2016 documents. You accused me of being Trump's puppet. You questioned my principles. But you paid for fake opposition research and then watched as it was used to spy on American citizens and delegitimize an election. You've spent years promoting a narrative you helped create with paid political dirt. He looked at Hillary. That's not principle, Mrs. Clinton. That's propaganda, and you've never been held accountable for it. Vance walked to the front of the dais for his conclusion. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of his footsteps echoed like drumbeats. Every eye was on him, every camera focused. This was the moment that would be remembered, the summation that would define not just this hearing, but the legacy of Hillary Clinton herself. Mrs. Clinton, You came here today to lecture me about experience, about judgment, about qualifications for high office. You've been doing this for 40 years. Lecturing, condescending, explaining to everyone else how things should be done. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the chamber before settling back on Hillary. So let's review your experience. Let's see what 40 years of Hillary Clinton has actually produced. He raised one finger. Benghazi. 4 Americans dead because your department denied their security requests. You knew the night of the attack that it was terrorism. You wrote it in an email to your daughter. And then you looked grieving parents in the eye and blamed a YouTube video. You lied to the families of the dead. A second finger. The emails. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information, on an unsecured private server. When you were subpoenaed, you destroyed evidence. You had your staff use bleach-bit and hammers to ensure the emails couldn't be recovered. Anyone else would be in prison. You laughed about it. A third finger. The foundation. You took tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments while you were Secretary of State. You took money from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from regimes that execute women for being raped. Your husband's speaking fees doubled when entities had business before your department. You sold access to American foreign policy. A fourth finger. Bill's accusers. You presented yourself as a champion of women while spending decades destroying women who accused your husband. You called Monica Lewinsky a narcissistic Looney Tune. You ran a bimbo eruptions team to silence victims. You allegedly threatened a woman who said your husband raped her. A fifth finger. 2016. You called working-class Americans deplorables and irredeemables. You were too arrogant to campaign in states you needed to win. You paid for fake opposition research that was used to spy on American citizens. And when you lost, you blamed everyone but yourself. Vance lowered his hand. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your 40 years in public life. Scandal after scandal, failure after failure. And never, not once, have you taken responsibility for any of it. He walked closer to the witness table. You asked me what I know about foreign policy. I know enough not to get 4 Americans killed and then lie about why. I know enough not to compromise classified information on a server in my basement. I know enough not to take money from governments that stone women to death. His voice grew stronger. You asked about my qualifications. I'm qualified enough not to destroy evidence under subpoena. I'm qualified enough not to sell access to the highest bidder. I'm qualified enough not to blame everyone else when I fail. He looked directly into her eyes. You called me inexperienced, but your experience is 40 years of scandal, corruption, and failure. That's not a qualification, Mrs. Clinton. That's a warning. You called me a hypocrite for changing my views on Trump, but I changed my views openly. I didn't hide it. I explained why. You've spent 40 years hiding evidence, destroying documents, and attacking anyone who questions you. You called me a puppet, but you're the one who sold access to foreign governments. You're the one whose husband's speaking fees depended on what your department was reviewing. You're the one who's been bought and paid for by every special interest with a checkbook. You called me a misogynist, but you're the one who destroyed women to protect your husband's career. You're the one who called a 22-year-old intern a Looney Tune. You're the one who allegedly threatened a rape victim. Vance straightened. You came here today to destroy me, Mrs. Clinton, to remind everyone why you should have been president, to prove that you're still the most formidable figure in American politics. He shook his head slowly. But all you've done is remind everyone why they didn't vote for you, why they don't trust you. Why 40 years of Hillary Clinton has left a trail of scandals, lies, and failures that you've never been held accountable for. His voice dropped lower, more intense. Some people spend 40 years enriching themselves, covering up scandals, destroying anyone who gets in their way, and then demanding that America make them president. Those people are you. And today, finally, everyone watching gets to see the full record, not the carefully curated image, not the media-friendly version. The truth. He returned to his seat. I yield my time. The chamber sat in stunned silence. For perhaps the first time in her 40-year public career, Hillary Clinton had been comprehensively, systematically dismantled, not by partisan accusations, but by her own record, documented and presented with devastating thoroughness. She sat motionless at the witness table. The color had drained from her face. Her hands, usually so animated when she spoke, lay flat on the table, trembling slightly. Her staff surrounded her, whispering urgently, but she didn't seem to hear them. She was staring at nothing, her eyes unfocused, as if she were watching her entire legacy burn in real time. In the gallery, Bill Clinton sat with his jaw clenched, his face flushed with impotent rage. He had watched many attacks on his wife over the years. He had helped her survive them. But this was different. This wasn't an attack. It was an autopsy. It was the careful dissection of 40 years of carefully constructed lies. And there was no defense against the truth. The Democratic senators who had been so eager to see Hillary destroy Vance were now looking at their phones, at their papers, at anything except the witness table. There was nothing to say, no spin that could undo what had just happened. The documentation was there. The emails were real. The financial records were real. The testimony of the families was real. You couldn't spin away reality when it was displayed on screens for the entire nation to see. Chairman Menendez attempted to restore normalcy, his voice strained. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." "No," Hillary's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "I have a response." The room went quiet. Every eye turned back to her. She leaned into her microphone, her hands trembling visibly now, a sight no one had ever witnessed before. Hillary Clinton never trembled. "Mr. Vice President, you've delivered quite a prosecution. Very thorough. Very well prepared. I can see why you went to Yale Law School." She attempted a smile. It looked like a grimace. "But everything you've said has been said before. I've faced these accusations for decades. I've been investigated by Congress, by the FBI, by special prosecutors. And I'm still here. Because the accusations don't hold up. Because they're politically motivated. Because—" "Mrs. Clinton." Vance's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through her words like a scalpel. "I didn't make accusations. I read documents, your emails, your foundation's financial records, your campaign's FEC filings, the FBI's report, the congressional testimony." He held up the folders. "These aren't accusations. They're your own words, your own actions, your own record. If you have an explanation for any of it, an actual explanation, not a deflection, I'm happy to hear it." Hillary stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Vance's voice remained steady. "Why did you tell your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night of Benghazi, and then tell the American people it was a YouTube video?" "Silence." "Why did you destroy 33,000 emails after they were subpoenaed?" "Silence." "Why did the Clinton Foundation accept tens of millions from Saudi Arabia while you were Secretary of State?" "Silence." "Why did your husband speaking fees double for entities with business before your department?" "Silence." "Why did you approach Juanita Broaddrick at that campaign event if she was lying?" "Silence." Vance set down the folders with finality. "You've spent 40 years avoiding these questions, Mrs. Clinton, deflecting, blaming your accusers, claiming it's all political. But you've never actually answered them. You've never explained the documents. You've never taken responsibility." He looked at her with something that might have been pity. "And now everyone watching knows why. Because there are no good answers. There's only the record, and the record is damning." Hillary opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She opened it again. Nothing came out. The most practiced speaker in American politics, the woman who had given thousands of speeches and survived hundreds of hostile interviews, had no words. After a long moment, she gathered her papers slowly, mechanically, like someone moving through water. Her staff moved to help her rise from the table. The protective entourage that had swept into the chamber 3 hours ago now formed a defensive perimeter, shielding her from the cameras as she walked toward the exit. No one asked questions. What was there to ask? The documents spoke for themselves. As she passed the dais, Vance was organizing his folders, speaking quietly with an aide. He looked up as Hillary passed. Their eyes met across the space of the chamber. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Mrs. Clinton," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "But you attacked my family, my background, my integrity. You opened the door. I just walked through it." Hillary said nothing. She kept walking, her face a mask, her staff forming a tight circle around her. She didn't stop until she was in her car, surrounded by tinted glass, away from the cameras that had captured every moment of her humiliation. Only then, alone in the back seat as the car pulled away from the Capitol, did she allow herself to understand what had happened. For 40 years, she had believed she was untouchable, too powerful, too connected, too important. Every scandal had been weathered. Every investigation had been survived. Every accuser had been discredited or ignored. The machine she and Bill had built was supposed to protect them from everything. But the documents had always been there. The emails, the financial records, the testimony from the families of the dead, the women her husband had abused, waiting for someone willing to compile them, organize them, and present them without fear of the Clinton machine. J.D. Vance hadn't been afraid. He had prepared methodically, waited patiently, and struck devastatingly. He had done what 40 years of opponents had failed to do. He had held her accountable. And now her legacy, the carefully constructed narrative of Hillary Clinton, feminist icon, foreign policy expert, most qualified candidate ever, lay in ruins. Her phone began buzzing with messages. She turned it off. She couldn't face it yet. She couldn't face any of it. The video went viral within hours. 20 million views by midnight, 50 million by the next morning, 120 million views in the first 48 hours. The Reckoning, as the media quickly dubbed it, became the most-watched congressional hearing in American history. Clips were shared across every platform. The moment Vance held up the email to Chelsea, the list of foreign donations to the Clinton Foundation, the names of the women Bill had assaulted, the confrontation about the destroyed emails. Each clip had millions of views on its own. Analysis pieces flooded the internet. Conservative outlets celebrated the exposure of Clinton corruption they had been documenting for decades. Liberal outlets scrambled to defend Hillary, but their defenses sounded hollow when viewers could simply watch the hearing and see the documents for themselves. The phrase 40 years of failure became a meme. Images of Hillary's face draining of color as Vance presented each new folder became iconic. The contrast between her confident attack at the beginning and her silent, defeated exit at the end was played on loop. The political fallout was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, 3 major Democratic donors announced they were distancing themselves from the Clintons. Within a week, that number had grown to 20. The Clinton Foundation, already diminished since 2016, saw its remaining donors flee. Board members resigned quietly, citing scheduling conflicts and family commitments. Major partners announced they were ending their relationships with the organization. Within weeks, the foundation announced it was scaling back operations and refocusing its mission. Within months, it was effectively dormant. The massive apparatus that had raised $2 billion was reduced to a skeleton staff managing the slow process of dissolution. Democratic politicians who had spent decades cultivating Clinton relationships suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts when asked to appear with her. The invitations to party events dried up. The requests for endorsements stopped coming. The phone calls from ambitious candidates seeking her blessing grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. Hillary Clinton's famous network, built over 40 years of favors and fundraisers and political IOUs, dissolved almost overnight. The people who had claimed to be her closest allies were suddenly unavailable. The politicians who had praised her publicly were silent. The media figures who had defended her for decades moved on to other stories. The speaking circuit dried up. Hillary had commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars per speech after leaving the State Department. Universities, corporations, advocacy groups had lined up to pay for access to her wisdom and experience. Within a month of the hearing, every scheduled speech was quietly canceled. New invitations stopped coming. The boards and commissions that had been eager to add Hillary's name to their letterhead quietly removed her. The consulting contracts were terminated. The advisory positions were eliminated. The prestigious appointments evaporated. The elder stateswoman status she had cultivated since 2016 disappeared. She had envisioned herself as a respected voice on foreign policy, a sage advisor to the next generation of democratic leaders. Instead, she became radioactive, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything voters distrusted about political dynasties and establishment corruption. 2 weeks after the hearing, Hillary Clinton released a statement through her office. "I am proud of my 40 years of public service and stand by my record. I will continue to advocate for the causes I believe in." But she made no public appearances. She granted no interviews. She had nothing left to say. What could she say? The documents were real. The emails were real. The foundation donations were real. The lies to the families were real. No amount of spin could change that. Bill Clinton, never one to stay silent when attacked, attempted a defense on a Sunday talk show 3 weeks after the hearing. It went poorly. The host, sensing blood in the water, simply played clips from the hearing and asked for explanations. Why did Hillary tell Chelsea it was Al-Qaeda and tell the families it was a video? Bill rambled about the fog of war and evolving intelligence assessments. His famous verbal dexterity failed him. He sounded defensive, evasive, old. What about the 33,000 deleted emails? Bill claimed they were personal emails about yoga routines and Chelsea's wedding. The host pointed out that destroying evidence under subpoena was a crime regardless of what was in the emails. Bill had no response. The Clinton Foundation received $145 million from Uranium One investors while the sale was being reviewed. How do you explain that? Bill grew flustered, insisting there was no quid pro quo, that the timing was coincidental. But he couldn't explain why investors in a pending deal would donate such massive sums to his foundation. He couldn't explain why his speaking fees had doubled during Hillary's time at state. The interview was a disaster. Clips of Bill's stammering non-answers went viral alongside clips of the original hearing. If anything, his attempted defense made things worse, reminding everyone of his own history of lies and cover-ups. After that, Bill stopped trying to defend Hillary publicly. The famous Clinton partnership, the 2-for-1 deal that had defined their political marriage, was over. They had survived scandals before by presenting a united front, by attacking their accusers, by spinning and deflecting until the media moved on. But this time, there was no united front to present. The evidence was too comprehensive. The documentation was too thorough. The lies were too obvious when laid out in sequence with the corresponding documents. The Clintons retreated to Chappaqua. Photographers occasionally captured them walking on their property or attending a local event. They looked smaller somehow, diminished. The aura of power that had surrounded them for decades was gone. They looked like what they had always been underneath the carefully constructed image, an aging couple whose time had passed. Bill played golf. Hillary tended her garden. They saw a few old friends, though the visits grew less frequent as months passed. The house that had once been a hub of political activity, filled with strategists and donors and rising stars seeking the Clinton blessing, was quiet now, empty. 1 year after the hearing, a major streaming service aired a documentary about the Clinton era titled The Reckoning, The Rise and Fall of Hillary Clinton. It was comprehensive, running nearly 4 hours, and featured extensive footage from the Vance hearing interspersed with interviews and historical analysis. The documentary interviewed former Clinton staffers, some of whom spoke openly for the first time now that there was no career cost to honesty. "We always knew the vulnerabilities were there," one former State Department aide said. "Benghazi, the emails, the foundation. We had responses prepared, but they were deflections, not explanations. We thought if we just kept deflecting long enough, people would move on. They always had before." Another staffer who had worked on both Clinton presidential campaigns was more blunt. "The problem was we started believing our own spin. We convinced ourselves that we were the victims, that every accusation was just politics, that we were always right and everyone else was always wrong. We lost the ability to see ourselves clearly." A former senior advisor went even further. "Look, I loved Hillary, I believed in her. But the Vance hearing forced me to confront things I'd been avoiding for years. The lies to the Benghazi families, the destroyed emails, the foundation donations from foreign governments. I had explained it all away in my head, rationalized it because I wanted to believe in her. But when Vance laid it all out with the actual documents, I couldn't rationalize it anymore. It was just there, undeniable. The documentary also interviewed Vance, who reflected on why he had chosen to confront Hillary so directly. "She attacked my family," he said simply, sitting in his office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. "She mocked my mother's addiction. She called my story a fraud. She looked down on everything I came from with such obvious contempt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But honestly, that wasn't why I did it. I did it because someone needed to. For 40 years, the Clintons operated above the rules. Investigations would start, then mysteriously stall. Evidence would disappear. Witnesses would change their stories. The media would lose interest, and nothing would ever happen." He gestured to the folders still stacked on his desk, the same folders from the hearing. "I had the documents. I had the platform. I had nothing to lose. She had already attacked me as hard as she could, so I laid out the record. I let the facts speak for themselves." He shrugged. "The facts were devastating, not because I framed them unfairly, but because they were true. She lied about Benghazi. She compromised classified information. She sold access through her foundation. She destroyed women to protect her husband. She paid for fake opposition research. None of that was my accusation. It was all documented. I just presented it in one place at one time where she couldn't deflect or change the subject or blame her accusers." The documentary concluded with footage of the Clinton home in Chappaqua, the camera slowly zooming in on the windows, then cut to Vance at his desk in the vice president's office. "Some people believe they're above accountability," Vance said in the final interview. "They believe that if they're powerful enough, connected enough, important enough, the rules don't apply to them. They believe they can do whatever they want and never face consequences." He looked directly at the camera. "Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they go their whole lives without being held accountable for anything." His expression hardened slightly. "But not always. Sometimes someone stands up. Sometimes someone asks the questions. Sometimes someone presents the evidence. And suddenly all that power, all those connections, all that importance, none of it matters, because the truth is on the record, and the truth doesn't care how powerful you are." He smiled slightly. Hillary Clinton learned that lesson 40 years too late, but she learned it. And maybe that's the real legacy of that hearing. Not that one politician was exposed, but that accountability is still possible, that no one is truly above the law, that the truth eventually comes out. The documentary ended with the final moments of the hearing. Hillary Clinton, ashen-faced, walking out of the chamber in silence, surrounded by her staff. Then Vance, calmly organizing his papers, preparing for the next task. The screen faded to black. Text appeared. "Hillary Clinton has made no significant public appearances since the hearing. The Clinton Foundation effectively ceased operations in 2026. J.D. Vance continues to serve as Vice President of the United States." In his private moments, Vance sometimes thought about that day. Not with satisfaction, though there had been some of that, but with a kind of wonder at how fragile even the most formidable reputations could be when confronted with the truth. Hillary Clinton had spent 40 years building an image, the smartest woman in the room, the most experienced candidate, the inevitable president. She had surrounded herself with protectors. She had cultivated the media. She had accumulated power and influence until she seemed untouchable. And it had all collapsed in 3 hours, not because of a brilliant attack or a devious strategy, but because someone had simply presented the documented record, the emails she had written, the donations she had accepted, the women she had attacked, the lies she had told. The truth had always been there. It just needed someone willing to say it out loud. Vance kept one item from that day in his desk drawer, a handwritten note that had arrived at his office a week after the hearing. It was from Patricia Smith, mother of Sean Smith, who had died in Benghazi. "Dear Mr. Vice President," it read in shaky handwriting. "I watched the hearing. I cried through most of it. For 12 years I've been waiting for someone to hold her accountable for lying to me about my son's death. For 12 years I've been told to move on, to let it go, to accept that some people are too powerful to face consequences. You showed me that's not true. You showed me that my son's death mattered, that the lies told over his coffin mattered. Thank you for not forgetting him. Thank you for speaking the truth. God bless you, Patricia Smith." That letter was why he had done it. Not for the political victory, not for the viral clips, not for the satisfaction of watching Hillary Clinton finally face accountability. He had done it because Sean Smith had died and his mother had been lied to, and someone needed to say so. Because Monica Lewinsky had been a young woman destroyed by powerful people, and someone needed to acknowledge it. Because working-class Americans had been called deplorables by someone who wanted their votes, and someone needed to call it out. The powerful believe they're above consequences. Usually they're right. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone stands up. And on that day in that chamber, J.D. Vance had stood up. The truth had done the rest. The broader implications of the hearing rippled through American politics for years. For the Democratic Party, it marked the definitive end of the Clinton era. For 3 decades, the Clintons had been the dominant force in Democratic politics. The fundraising network, the policy apparatus, the media relationships, all flowed through them. Their tentacles reached into every corner of the party. The hearing shattered that dominance. Donors who had written checks to the Clinton orbit for decades quietly redirected their money elsewhere. Politicians who had built their careers on Clinton endorsements suddenly discovered they had independent identities. The party began the painful process of defining itself without reference to Bill and Hillary. Some Democrats privately expressed relief. "We'd been trapped in their orbit for so long, we forgot there was anywhere else to be," one senior strategist told a reporter off the record. "They demanded loyalty, but what did they give us? Scandal after scandal, loss after loss. And they never took responsibility for any of it." The hearing was brutal to watch, but maybe it was necessary. Maybe we needed someone to finally say out loud what we'd all been thinking for years. The Clintons weren't good for us. They were good for themselves. For the Republican Party, the hearing confirmed what they had always believed about the Clintons but had never been able to prove in a way that penetrated the media bubble. The documentation Vance presented, the emails, the financial records, the testimony, was not new. It had all been available for years, but it had never been assembled in one place, presented by a credible figure in a forum that demanded attention. The media protected them for so long, one Republican congressman said. Every scandal was treated as a partisan attack. Every accusation was framed as right-wing conspiracy. But Vance didn't attack. He documented. He let her own words, her own records, her own actions speak for themselves. The media couldn't spin that. For ordinary Americans, the hearing became a symbol of something larger, the possibility that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. In an era of widespread cynicism about institutions, the spectacle of a former Secretary of State being systematically confronted with her own record resonated deeply. "I didn't vote for Trump or Vance," one viewer told a reporter in a viral interview that circulated widely on social media. "But watching that hearing, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that the rules apply to everyone. Hope that you can't just lie and cover up and destroy evidence and never face consequences. Hope that the truth still matters." That hope, perhaps, was the hearing's most lasting legacy. Not the political damage to the Clintons. They would have faded eventually anyway. Not the boost to Vance's career. He was already vice president. But the reminder that accountability was still possible. That someone with the courage to document the truth and present it fearlessly could pierce even the most carefully constructed defenses. In schools and universities, the hearing became a case study in multiple disciplines. Political science classes analyzed its strategic implications. Law schools examined its evidentiary methods. Media studies programs dissected its coverage and impact. Communication departments studied its rhetoric. What made it effective, one professor explained to her students at Georgetown, was its simplicity. He didn't editorialize, he didn't exaggerate, he just presented documents and asked questions. "You wrote this email, what did you mean? You received this donation, why? You made this statement, was it true?" The power wasn't in the accusations. It was in the evidence, and once the evidence was on the record, there was no way to spin it away. 5 years after the hearing, A journalist tracked down several people who had been in the chamber that day, seeking their reflections now that time had passed and passions had cooled. Michael, a Democratic staffer who had helped prepare Hillary's testimony, was now working in the private sector. He agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. "We thought we were setting a trap for Vance," he said over coffee in a downtown Washington cafe. Hillary was going to lecture him about experience, make him look like a child playing at adult games. "We had all these great lines prepared." He shook his head, staring into his cup. "We never considered that he might have prepared too, that he might have spent months compiling documentation, that he was letting her attack because every attack gave him an opening to respond. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. She had spent an hour attacking his credentials, his background, his family. And then he spent 2 hours laying out her actual record. Every scandal, every lie, every document." He looked up. I'll never forget the look on her face when he started talking about Benghazi. She had answered those questions 100 times. She had survived a dozen congressional hearings on it. She thought she was bulletproof, but he wasn't asking the usual questions. He was showing her own emails, her letter to Chelsea the night of the attack, and he was asking simple questions she couldn't deflect. "Why did you tell your daughter it was Al-Qaeda and tell the families it was a video?" There was no good answer. There never had been. She had just never been forced to confront that before. Not like that. Not with the documents right there. Another staffer who had worked in the Clinton orbit for years was more philosophical. "They believed they were untouchable," she said, sitting in her office overlooking K Street. "And for a long time they were right. Every investigation fizzled. Every scandal blew over. Every accuser was discredited. They got away with things that would have destroyed anyone else. But that created a kind of arrogance. They stopped being careful. They assumed nothing would ever catch up with them. And then one day it did." She paused, looking out the window at the Washington Monument in the distance. "Vance didn't do anything magical. He just did what a good prosecutor does. He compiled the evidence, organized it logically, and presented it clearly. The evidence had always been there. Someone just finally used it." She turned back. "I think about all the people they hurt over the years, the women Bill assaulted, the staffers who got caught up in scandals, the voters who trusted them and got lied to. None of those people ever got justice, but maybe in a strange way the hearing was justice. Not legal justice, nobody went to prison, but a kind of historical justice. The truth finally got told on the record in front of the world. The carefully constructed image finally cracked. The legend finally died. That has to count for something. In Chappaqua, the Clintons live quietly now. Bill plays golf at the local country club, though fewer people seek out his company than before. Hillary tends her garden, the physical work a welcome distraction from thoughts she'd rather not think. Occasionally old friends visit, though the visits grow less frequent each year. They don't talk about the hearing. They don't talk about politics much at all. The television is usually tuned to old movies or cooking shows, anything but news. The newspapers pile up unread. The phones ring less often. Sometimes late at night, Hillary walks to her study and looks at the photographs on the wall. Her with world leaders, Putin, Xi, Merkel, Netanyahu. At the State Department, standing behind the podium with the seal. At campaign rallies, surrounded by thousands of cheering supporters, their faces full of hope and belief. A different life. A different Hillary. One who believed she was destined to be president. One who believed the rules were for other people. One who believed she would never be held accountable for anything. That Hillary is gone now. The hearing killed her as surely as if Vance had fired a bullet through her carefully constructed persona. What remains is an elderly woman in a big house, surrounded by memories of a power she no longer has, and a legacy that lies in ruins. She tells herself she was treated unfairly, that it was all political. That history will vindicate her. But late at night, alone with her thoughts, she knows the truth. The documents were real, the lies were real, the corruption was real. For 40 years, she got away with it. And then one day, she didn't. Someone did something, they compiled the evidence, they asked the questions, they spoke the truth. And the truth finally set everyone free. The truth set Patricia Smith free from 12 years of gaslighting about her son's death. It set Monica Lewinsky free from decades of being portrayed as the villain instead of the victim. It set the voters free from the fiction that the Clintons were somehow different from other corrupt politicians, that their scandals were manufactured by partisan enemies rather than documented reality. And in a strange way, it set Hillary Clinton free too, free from the exhausting performance of pretending to be something she wasn't, free from the constant effort to maintain an image that required lies upon lies to sustain, free from the prison of her own ambition. She couldn't see that yet, sitting in her study late at night, staring at photographs of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. But perhaps someday she would understand that the hearing, as devastating as it was also a kind of liberation. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. And after 40 years of lies, the truth had finally been told. In Washington, in newsrooms, in living rooms across America, people who had watched the hearing would remember where they were when they saw it. The way previous generations remembered where they were when Kennedy was shot, when the towers fell, when Obama was elected. They would remember the look on Hillary Clinton's face when Vance held up the email to Chelsea. They would remember the silence in the chamber when he asked why she lied to the families. They would remember her walking out, defeated, surrounded by staff who could no longer protect her from her own record. And they would remember the lesson, that no one, no matter how powerful, is truly above accountability, that the truth matters, that documents don't lie, even when politicians do, that sometimes, just sometimes, someone stands up and says what needs to be said. And when they do, the world changes. 3 hours. That's all it took. 3 hours to dismantle 40 years of carefully constructed mythology. 3 hours to expose what had been hiding in plain sight all along. 3 hours to prove that power without integrity is just a house of cards, impressive from a distance, but collapsing at the first strong wind. J.D. Vance had been that wind, and Hillary Clinton's house of cards had fallen. The end.